Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today in this Martin Center discussion on the EU's Mutual Assistance Clause and how it should be developed. My name is Dr. Niklas Novaki. I am a research officer here at the Martin Center focusing on EU foreign security and defense policy, and it is a great pleasure for me to be moderating this discussion today on the EU's Mutual Assistance Clause, also known as the Article 42.7 of the Treaty on European Union, which, just to remind all of you, says more or less that if a member state is the subject of armed aggression on its territory, then the other member states shall have the obligation of providing aid and assistance by all the means in their power to that member state. And today we have an excellent lineup of speakers discussing this topic with me here today. We have Ms. Henna Virkkunen, member of the European Parliament from the EPP group and former Finnish minister. Welcome, Ms. Virkkunen. We also have Dr. Anna Wieslander, Director for Northern Europe from the Atlantic Council. Welcome, Dr. Wieslander. And last, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Elena Lazaru, Acting Head of the External Policies Unit from the European Parliamentary Research Service, the European Parliament's own in-house think tank. This topic, Article 42.7, is something that I have personally been following for quite some time and for several years. It's something that was first came up in the discussions on the Convention of the Future of Europe, which drafted the EU's failed constitution. And once that constitution was voted down in French and Dutch polls, it was eventually incorporated into the Lisbon Treaty, which was agreed in 2007. And entered into force in 2009. And for a long time, member states, policymakers, and experts, they didn't really make too much of that clause because it was a little bit of an anomaly in the treaty because what the EU was doing in the area of security and defense wasn't really related to that hardcore of defense issues. And also, most member states were covered by another much more better known mutual assistance clause, and that is, of course, Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. But then in 2015, things changed. France invoked the article for the first time, asking member states to contribute to various French national, European, and international operations so that it could then relieve its own troops from those missions and focus more on the fight against ISIS in the Middle East. But regardless, there's still quite a lot of different perspectives among the member states, among policy experts, of what EU Article 42.7 actually means and how it could be implemented. And I think this is a particularly good time to be having this discussion because the European Union has already discussed for some time the precise meaning of Article 42.7. It was discussed at the end of last year amongst the EU ambassadors in the Political and Security Committee. This autumn, the European Union will also organize several tabletop exercises on the implementation of Article 42.7 to learn a little bit what could be done in its context. And it will also be discussed in the framework of the forthcoming strategic compass, which will be agreed by 2022, and then which will henceforth then show direction to the EU security and defense policies. And in Brussels, we often discuss the specific legal specificities and things like the relationship of the article to NATO's Article 5, but we don't discuss that much what are the different perspectives that member states and other experts have on the article and what sort of expectations they have. So that is why I wanted to have this highly interesting discussion today. And just remind very quickly about the House rules. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with them. I will first ask each of the speakers to speak about 7 minutes, on the topic. I might ask some follow-up questions as well to stimulate already discussion in between. But there will then be a Q&A session after each of the speakers have provided their input. And you can all ask questions by commenting on the event's Facebook side, and then those comments will be passed on to me. But without further ado, I would like to pass the floor first to Ms. Henna Virkkunen. What do you think on the of the Article 42.7? And from your perspective, I mean, how should it be developed?
Yeah, thank you for this invitation and your opening remarks also. From the Finnish perspective, this is very interesting topic, because I think Finland is one of the member states who has been very active and also interested in this mutual defense clause 42.7 article. And there has been also quite much discussion on that in Finland, especially 2 years ago when we had the presidential elections. There was a lot of discussion about the European Defence Union and also about this article. What does it mean? And I think maybe it's also the main question in Finnish politics, that what does it really mean? Because we know that different member states, they are interpreting in very different ways. What does it mean, this clause? And also, I think for most of the member states, it's not so important than for Finland, because the reason why Finland is so interested in that and why it has been an important topic in Finnish politics is that Finland is not member in NATO, like most of the other European Union's member states. And of course, we have also very big neighbor and aggressive neighbor, Russia. And that's why the discussion on NATO membership, it haven't been very active in Finland during the last years. Majority of the political parties, they are not supporting Finland to join NATO, but they are very interested in the European defense cooperation. And that's why also this mutual defense clause has been so important. But it has been the main question really in Finland, that what does it really mean? Because there is not much clarity on that. Like I said, different member states, they are interpreting it very different ways. And we know that if use had to be made on this mutual defense clause, the situation would be very unclear if we are looking at it now, because we don't have any guidance or definitions of the roles of the different institutions. So I think the first problem would be the decision-making process, because now it means that all the member states, they should have bilateral meetings and discussions. What does it mean? So we don't have, like European Commission, for example, doesn't have a role here really here. And how these institutions, how they could ensure that different authorities could act effectively and would avoid unnecessary uncertainties. And I think this everything with how we are operating, it's very unclear. So it should be clarified. And also, of course, there is also questions on that what this assistance obligation really means concretely, what kind of assistance it is. And now, of course, it depends very much what the member states are agreeing. Like we saw when France was asking others to help them, then all the member states, they could a little bit decide themselves that what kind of assistance they are giving to France. And it would be the case again now. So I think if we are really speaking about serious attacks, European Union would be all too slowly to react. And I think if we want to have a good response from the European Union side, clarity is needed there, that how the decisions are made and also what kind of assistance this means. And of course, important role would be also that we are also running exercises, and that we are not doing. If we are comparing to NATO, for example, where the Article 5 is the core of everything. So all the NATO member states, they are all the time exercising for that. But we are not running exercises in advance to try out the procedures and methodologies like we should do. So I think in Finland there has been a lot of interest to that and many questions. But now we are very much expecting that something should happen also in this field, because we know that I think the discussion was quite active after the Paris attacks, and when France was the first country who wanted to activate this mutual defense clause. And also very soon after that, Commission was also actively promoting different ideas of European Defense Union. And we know that also when Commission was proposing their proposal for MFF, they were also proposing much more funding to military mobility or defense industry funding than the Council now decide on their decision in July. So I think there was much more expectations also from the Finnish side that now European Union would take really big steps on the defense and security sector also. But I think now it seems that the ambitions are not so, they are not so high anymore. Mainly because there has been big cuts now in MFF. The Council didn't support the Commission's proposal to invest much more to military mobility or the defense industry. And it's big disappointment also in the European Parliament side, because we really see that the defense and security is one of the sectors to where we should invest more as a European Union. And of course, now there is maybe new expectations when we are speaking about this strategic compass. And we know that France has been one of the member states who has been very active also to speak about this European defense policy. And of course, now when we are coming towards France presidency in the European Union, we are expecting that then maybe some steps. We are taking one few new steps during their presidency. But still, I think the discussion in Finland is that the more clarity is needed here, that what does it mean, this our mutual defense clause. And it's sure that it's important topic in Finland, as all the defense cooperation in the European Union. It's very important issue for us as a Finns. But still, I think, I think you Niklas said that there is very strong wording in this article. But then, if we should really use it, it means that the situation would be very, very unclear, because we don't have the same power than they have in NATO.
Perhaps just a quick follow-up. I mean, how does the Finnish political leadership, or the Finland in generally, kind of see the credibility aspect of the article, for example? Because there's often discussions about, whether EU defense cooperation could be helped to address all type of threats that Finland might face, or are there discussions related to that issue, for example?
I think there is maybe a little bit unrealistic expectations in Finland, because we are not members in NATO, and there is not active political discussion on this topic. So Finland has tried to be very active in all kind of different cooperation with different European member states. And we have many bilateral agreements with different member states. And I think there is a misunderstanding also in Finnish politics, because many politicians also, they think that this European Union's defense cooperation could replace NATO membership. And I think it's very important also to underline for the Finnish politicians and in the Finnish discussion that this is really complementary to NATO, that NATO remains the foundation of the collective defense for those who are members in NATO, like most of the European Union member states are. So I think this is maybe that in Finland there's a little bit unrealistic expectations also that this could replace NATO.
Thank you so much. And from Finland, I think we're going to make the natural transition across the border to Sweden. Dr. Wieslander, what do you think of these issues and about the future development of Article 42.7 or the Mutual Assistance Clause? I think you're still muted.
So now you hear me, I hope. Thank you, Niklas, and thanks to the Martin Center for arranging this timely discussion and for the invitation to say a few words on how Sweden views Article 42.7 and our expectations ahead. I'm a think tanker, I'm not a government official, so these are my personal views, but I'll try to capture the Swedish discussion so far and also put it into a broader framework of the European defense discussions that are ongoing and the transatlantic link, which is important for us. And it was very interesting for me to listen now to Hannah and the Finnish discussion, because it differs quite a lot. Sometimes you think of Sweden and Finland perhaps as twins, and then you look closer to us, we differ a bit. And this is one issue where we have a different setting, I think. We would have had a more active NATO debate in Sweden than perhaps in Finland, but on the other hand, much less of a debate on the EU and much less of expectations on the EU in this regard. So just if you look at the Swedish security policy, we are, of course, a member of the EU since 1995, not a member of NATO, but we define ourselves as politically aligned through the EU membership, but very clearly as military non-aligned. So that's a distinction which is important for us. And Sweden has never been neutral or military non-aligned by treaty. We have had 200 years of this stage, but, flexibly adopting a neutrality and non-military policy through all those years. That's how we navigate. And we have been successful. That's the general perception of staying out of war and keeping state sovereignty this way. So already in the 90s, just to make a flashback here to understand where we are today, when we started preparing for EU membership, we adopted the security doctrine of Sweden with a more emphasis on solidarity than isolation, and crucially to state clearly that we will do this in cooperation with others, handle security challenges. And we did this change both with regard to the EU and to NATO. So even if Article 42.7 did not exist at the time when we joined the EU, we had the Maastricht Treaty from 92, which kind of hinted at the future defense, CFSP, which required solidarity. So solidarity and cooperation with others, so the two key components of Swedish national security. We will not remain passive towards our neighbors in case of a crisis, a war, or in case of any EU members are threatened. We will meet these threats jointly. We're not a neutral country, and that's very important. With NATO, then, we have also gradually indulged in a very close cooperation, as has Finland, mainly through international missions and Partnership for Peace, but also in this past year in collective defense. And we are closest partners to NATO at this point. I would say that we are informal allies when it comes to the Baltic Sea region and its security, but we have not applied officially for membership. So given this expose, you might expect that Article 42.7 is not much of a problem for Sweden. And to some extent it's true, but there are also doubts and hesitation to, I believe, a larger degree than perhaps in Finland. And I try to explain how the thinking goes there. The way the article has been implemented so far is no problem for Sweden. Quite the contrary. When France evoked the article in 2015, we were fast to offer our support and to answer the requests that France had, and we supported with both ammunition and transport and staff, military staff, for instance. And there was a broad agreement that this was in the interest of Sweden. It was important that it was credible, Article 42.7, and also for the security policy of the EU. So credibility was important, and we did respond. So these kind of out-of-area situations where it's not about the territory of a single EU member state, then I think it's pretty unproblematic if you talk about scenarios of what we would respond to in the future. Another area is, more hybrid threat scenarios, non-military, cyber attacks or massive disinformation campaigns hitting at a few of the EU member states, strikes on energy flows or supplies. These kind of situations, I believe for Sweden, that makes sense from an EU perspective. The EU has a large degree of jurisdiction in these fields, and it makes sense from an EU perspective. But it's more problematic then when you look at it as an article which deals with collective defense, or there would be an antagonistic threat towards Sweden, and to activate this article kind of equally to Article 5 of NATO. It comes too close to having a security guarantee from the backyard and in, so to say. That's not what we are. We are still military non-aligned. That is the Swedish official line. We can have informal statuses and constructions, but not formal security, treaty-bound security guarantees when it comes to national defense. And this is also, which is a bit perhaps difficult to understand for others, since we are not members of NATO, but we think it is a task for NATO, and it's a task which it's important that NATO maintains its credibility. And here you have to understand, I think, that for Sweden, the transatlantic link is crucial for our national security. We have not taken the step of joining NATO, but we have strong bilateral cooperation with the US. We had that during the Cold War. We had also preparations for receiving help. We still have that. We are working on that all the time, basically. We have closest partner relation to NATO. We have the host nation support treaty and a range of other close bilateral relationships and international cooperation going. So this is kind of a patchwork of cooperation that we see as guaranteeing us, and the US and NATO are core in that. So anything that risks weakening the US commitment to European security is not in Sweden's interest, and there our kind of hesitation towards Article 42.7 lies in those aspects of it, I think. So just to conclude there, I think this underlines the importance of understanding the signaling when you discuss Article 42.7 in relation to strategic autonomy, strategic compass, which scenarios we choose, and wordings in future, for instance, political declarations. We would be keen to have the Americans and the transatlantic framework clearly visible in relation to 42.7 for those things, so that we reach a better level of calibrating what is European autonomy and what goes with 42.7 and what we can do within the larger European transatlantic framework. Because the Americans are wary of this emphasis on drifts and distancing, as they see, and we think that is not good for European security. So I can have more examples of that. We can look at the Baltic Sea region and discuss, the implementation of how this would go, but I'm happy to do that also in the Q&A, elaborate upon that. The links between Article 5 and this article when it comes to collective defense. But I think to sum up, I think the solidarity which the article provides is very important from a Swedish perspective, and also to back this with concrete action if implemented. But a pragmatic stance and a maintained transatlantic awareness is also important in order for this to be credible as a whole. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Perhaps just a quick follow-up, because you raised a very interesting point about how in Sweden there is at least some level of concern that developing Article 42.7 into a certain specific type of direction could potentially like weaken the transatlantic link between the United States and Sweden or Europe more broadly. So could you perhaps kind of elaborate kind of how, I mean, that, like, what exactly is the risk and like how that might happen?
Well, I think if you look at the risk from our perspective would be if you signal that this is something that we count on instead of US engagement in case of a crisis, for instance, in the Baltic Sea region. As Hen also said, there are no muscles within the EU or along only European powers to handle a situation where we'd have a threatening Russia, for instance, for us. We would immediately be dependent on US support in such situations, and anything else is not realistic. So there has been discussions on, that Sweden or Finland or other EU member states that are not members of NATO, would we be interested in, exploring how the collective defense mechanisms would go if there was such a threat to us? How would Europe on its own respond? And we think that, no, that's not realistic to explore. It sends the completely wrong signaling. Washington, D.C. is watching us doing this, and they wonder, why are you doing this? We have everything going. Why are you continuing to emphasize drift, distancing, going your own way? Why aren't you focusing on what we can do together, a joint transatlantic agenda? That's the latest skepticism I heard was on the strategic compass. What is it that are, explicit European threats that are not transatlantic threats that we will not be able to deal with together? What do you need the separate discussions for? And those, I think it's important if we want to have a strong continued transatlantic community with a certain degree of European autonomy in those cases where we need it. We need to embrace also those concerns and have perhaps a discussion which is not moving in the total direction of European independence. I think that is to go too far, and that could even be dangerous for several countries.
Thank you so much. And from Sweden, from the northern part of Europe, we're going to now move a bit more to the southern part of Europe. So Dr. Lazaru, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Thank you to the Martin Center for the invitation. I'm really honored to be on this panel with my northern counterparts, but I have to also start with my own caveats, which are I don't represent in any way Greece. So whatever I say that may have anything to do with Greece is very much my own opinion. And also for the next hour, I wouldn't like to be speaking on behalf, I don't speak on behalf of the Parliament or its research service, but rather my experience as a think tanker researching this topic. And I wanted to make this clear. Now, it's very interesting to follow up on two presentations on non-NATO members, because I think the fundamental difference about being a NATO member is something that I would perhaps want to focus on. But before I start on this, I wanted to just say that taking a step back, I think Article 42.7 is one of the many articles of the Lisbon Treaty on security and defense that essentially were formulated in a way that left a lot of room for interpretation, exactly because this treaty, let's not forget, is over 10 years now ago. And the specific future of European security and defense policy was not exactly, I believe, at the moment conceived in the way that it evolved, in the way that we've seen it evolve, particularly, let's not forget, this predates the Russian annexation of Crimea, it predates the global strategy, it predates Brexit. So I think a lot of the things we've been thinking about in the past 5 or 6 years are things that at the time of the way the article was formulated were not in the absolute awareness of people, perhaps some foresight people. So I think that's one of the reasons why today we are dealing with an article that is basically very open to interpretation, very subject to interpretation, and very vague, both in what it proposes to do, but also in the way that it proposes to do it. And if you look at the European Parliament specifically, it has been calling ever since 2012 for a more practical way of seeing this article, for practical arrangements, for an analysis of what the role of the institutions would be in its implementation, so for a well-defined framework for its activation and its implementation. And listening to the other presenters on this panel, I think that regardless of whether it's a NATO member or a non-NATO EU member, the sort of the desire and the appetite for refinement of these things, of the operationalization, of the guidelines, of whether there should be, for example, a review process, a monitoring, a time frame, all these things are in the minds of everyone who is dealing with it, and the Council itself, I think, made this quite clear last summer in its conclusion. So I think we're really in a moment where this becomes relevant, also in the context of the progress that has been made on other fronts on defense initiatives, and in spite of the limited financing that we are now seeing, unfortunately, being offered, nonetheless, we have at the moment an activated PESCO, which was also one of these underused articles. Some people refer to them as sleeping beauties. So now 47 also bears another question when we think about it, which is the PESCO developed capabilities, which are available to all PESCO participants, can also be linked to a situation of armed aggression and the defense of a state. And we also have a context of the strategic compass where, interestingly, 42.7 is included in the basket of resilience. And I think that's also important because resilience and self-defense or collective defense are not exactly the same thing. So it's interesting to see that 42.7 is being discussed in the context of resilience rather than self-defense. We will see how this develops, but I think there are some nuances there that are important to point out. Now, moving to the wider question of how does a NATO member, EU member, perceive 42.7, and perhaps what are the questions that arise, and even more so, let me make it a bit more concrete, for a state that is not big, so rather a medium, small size state. I think there are a few points to make. I think the first perhaps would be, what is the sequencing, or is there a sequencing of, or a compatibility of invoking 42.7 and Article 5? I mean, a lot of legal experts have said that if you look at treaty law, Article 5 could precede 42.7, but there are arguments to say, actually, there are situations where you could invoke both, because let's not forget that the aid and assistance that states are able to provide under NATO and under EU umbrellas are not always the same. The EU umbrella of what can be provided in the form of aid and assistance could be interpreted as being more than just military. So I think that's the first question we could put out there. The second is on the operationalization and the guidelines needed for activation, coordination, and implementation. I think there is a broader question which is very relevant, I would think, to smaller and medium-sized states, which is who essentially would manage and coordinate the contributions that are made. Because we've seen from the way France carried this out, yes, the discussions are bilateral, contributions are bilateral, but is there a need, particularly for a state with lesser capacities because of size, for a coordinating mechanism to be defined? Should it be the state itself that defines this? Should it be some EU institution, the External Action Service, which acts as a clearinghouse, facilitates the contributions? Should the Council be notified of all of the full list of contributions? Those things are not really mentioned in this article, which really does not mention any of the EU institutions in it. If you notice it, for example, in comparison to Article 222, you really see, which is a different article, but there is no mention of an EU-level institutional process. So I think that's a second question. The third is, what is the interpretation, then that's perhaps just for me, of armed aggression? I always found it interesting that it's aggression and not attack, as in the NATO respective article or in UN Article 51. So, and especially, what is the implication of armed aggression on one's territory in the age of 2020? Because in the age of 2020, let's not forget, we have hybrid threats, we have cyber threats, we have asymmetrical threats. We have the cyber domain officially as a domain of NATO, but I don't know if one would call it territory. So all of this is also, I believe, in the minds of those who try to refine how this article can be used. So how do we interpret this? And in fact, I think the Council Legal Service has agreed that it can also be something beyond traditional warfare. in the case where the attack or the aggression affects critical infrastructure, both defense and civilian. But I say this with some reticence because I have a feeling I read this, but I don't want to be 100% on something that I haven't double checked. And then I would also say that a last thing that I think is relevant to countries which are also NATO members is that the tabletop exercises, scenario building, best practices and flexibility are a very good step in a way, because let's not forget, under the EU-NATO joint declaration, training and exercises is something that is going on. I don't particularly see the incompatibility of at some point bringing these two together. So there is space through the EU-NATO joint declarations and the 74 priorities, through the fact that now in November we will be having these exercises and the strategic compass process to perhaps think of more ways in which we could refine some of these issues that are pending. And in any way, just to finish, because you mentioned Greece, I also want to reiterate, again, not as a spokesperson of the government, but as a person who is involved in the Greek public debate at times, that of course, on collective defense, NATO remains the pillar. And not only that, but Greece has a mutual defense agreement with the United States and a number of other EU members, most recently Portugal. So I think, as Anna said, the defense field and the alliances are, of course, a wide network of agreements and alliances. And of course, NATO still remains the pillar for collective defense. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. And perhaps kind of just to pick up very quickly on some of the final points you mentioned, because you mentioned the Greek perception on it. And I wanted to kind of ask if, because understandably, NATO's Article 5 is the main game in town. So is there kind of awareness within the Greek public that this kind of article also exists on the Treaty on European Union, or is the discussion kind of solely focused on Article 5?
In fact, in my understanding of the public debate, let's not forget, I read these things from Brussels, but I do interact a bit with the people there as well. Yes, I would find that in an unusual manner for the average EU member state, on this particular topic, there is quite a lot of awareness, quite a lot of public discourse. Interestingly, I find that the word solidarity is very much in the public discourse, and it's been a bit of a spillover from the financial crisis, where EU solidarity was being discussed, to defense issues. So the question of to what degree is there EU solidarity on various issues is always in the media in the last decade and in the public discourse. So I think, yes, there is relatively high awareness of the existence of this article. And let's not forget that for countries like Greece, joining the EU and the euro, actually, I'm saying this is not my opinion, it's publicly written, was also seen as a mechanism to ensure political support for national issues of national defense, that's national security. So I would say there's a very high context of perceiving the EU, as Anna said, of course, knowing it's mostly an alliance, a union which started as an economic union, but there is definitely in my mind a sense of, through the EU, being grounded and being really situated in a Western alliance of security as well, together with NATO and all the Western institutions.
Thank you so much. And we already have some questions from the audience. And there's one question about what kind of roles could the EU institutions play in the implementation of Article 42.7? But I think I'll kind of address this in slightly different form to all of you. So to Ellen, I would like to ask it the way it was said. So what kind of role could EU institutions play? To Ms. Virkkunen, I would like to ask, how do you see that the European Parliament could most concretely contribute to the development of the mutual assistance clause? Because, of course, it's a very intergovernmental instrument. So what would be the best means for the European Parliament to contribute? And then to Dr. Wieslander, I would like to address the same question in the form of, do you see that EU institutions even need to have a role in the implementation of 42.7? So I'll start this time with in the same order that we spoke before as well. So I'll give the floor first to Ms. Virkkunen.
Yes, Thank you, Nicholas. I think it was very, very interesting to hear the presentation and different views on this interesting article, which remains much things open. And I think, like it was said, that in the Parliament there has been a lot of appetite for that we would really like to see that we should have a clear definition what this article means, and we would like to see also role for the institutions. Like it was mentioned, the EU institutions, they are not mentioned here, and we don't have any procedure how to react and how to work if we should really activate this article, what we will do then. And I think this decision-making process, of course, it's one of the core problems we have here, because then if we should activate this article, it means that, of course, something has happened and we should have a very fast response for that. And it's difficult if everything is unclear that who is making decisions and how, and if it's just up to member states how they are deciding and what kind of assistance is given for each other. So I think from the Parliament side, we would like to see that the Commission should have a role here. And I think it would mean that we should have then more clarity, and we could have that kind of processes that we could also prepare for that. Because I think it's now one of the problems, of course, because we don't have experience, just one case, how to use this article. So I think it's very important that we should have clear roles for different institutions, how we are making the decisions, and then we could also run exercises, because like it was mentioned now many times, there is expectations now that we could use maybe this to hybrid threats and to cyber security also, and for that kind of new elements. And I think if we want to continue developing this article, it means that we should have scenario-based discussions on the political level. And then it's also very important that we could run exercises, that we could learn more, that how to be prepared when something really happens, that we can be effective and have a mutual response. So I think from the Parliament side, we would like to see that the Commission should play a more important role here. Then I think it would be more effective.
Thank you so much. Dr. Wieslander. I believe you're still muted.
So super interesting questions, really. And I would say from a Swedish perspective on the EU institutions, I think we would be a bit cautious. We would look at this as something which should remain at the national level, state level. I do not foresee that we would advocate a secretariat within the Commission dealing with it, even if we are, as Elena said, a smaller country, and it could be a huge task coordinating it only from the capital. So perhaps, one person or something like that, but not a major role for any EU institutions, because we would see that as a way of transferring sovereignty to levels that we would not be compatible with our security policy as it is now. So I would rather think that we could work forward more pragmatically. I think it's very important that if we move forward on 42.7, we need to address the threats of today, so to say, not to get stuck in exactly what is armed. It's an interesting question, of course, what is armed and not, and so on. But I think, on the other hand, let's look at perhaps what could be the threats that we need to deal with jointly, and when a country would actually sit and say, what help can we get from others to deal with this situation, and do we have neighbors that have the same situations, and is this something that we would use? I think the exercises and the institutional roles should come from lessons learned from exercises. That's the way I would see it built. Not to decide first and then exercise, but to see what do we actually need and how would it play out. I think that would be perhaps the most constructive way forward.
Thank you. Dr. Lazaru.
Thank you, Nicholas. Well, I think this question is needs to be qualified because the Council is an EU institution, the European Council is an institution, but that is actually the locus where this conversation takes place, exactly because this is an intergovernmental area. Article 31, you need unanimity. So it's different. They're very different ways of understanding what the different institutions should do and in what sequence. So if indeed there is a call, as there seems to be both from the Council and the Parliament, for a certain sense of operationalizing and creating guidelines for this, this should be something that should be done at the level of the Council, which is intergovernmental. But I think beyond that, there are a number of things that I mentioned that I think could be seen as roles for the institutions. The first is that if indeed it is agreed that the definition of armed aggression is a wide definition encompassing areas that may be more in EU competency than security and defense proper, which as we know is mostly intergovernmental. We also know the CSDP does not for the time being allow for operations of collective self-defense, so this is very clear. But if we're talking about hybrid, if we're talking about cyber, if we're talking about terrorism, I think it is in the EU institutions' mandate to an extent refine how that is to be used, what is in the EU's competence in this context, working together with the member states. I also think that if member states do agree so, and here I think I disagree with that. And I think a sort of, as I said, a clearinghouse role with absolutely no political decision-making mandate, but rather a mandate to sort of coordinate and perhaps, and here I will speak unfortunately or fortunately as someone who's been in the Parliament Secretariat for a while, but also for the sake of transparency and information, I think a coordinating role could be envisioned from some ad hoc setup through the institutions or just some level of the Commission or the EAS. As I said, merely for the transitional part, for the transaction, for the implementation, for the administration, the coordination. But that's just a thought. And I suppose the final thing about what the EU institutions could and should do, I think, oversee this process or sort of endorse this process of threat assessment that is going on among the member states right now. Because let's not forget again that Article 222, it's not the same, it's a very different article, a subject of another panel, but there are elements there that which are interesting. I mentioned some, the institutions are mentioned, but also Article 222 mentions the threat assessment, the relevance of a threat assessment for knowing when to use it. And this article doesn't. So I think since the EU institutions are to an extent involved right now in this process, I think also helping refine when this article should be used in terms of the priorities of the threats, what are really the threats to the member states, is something to be thought about. So I will stop there. I think it's still we're still far away from that, but it's something to think about.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of additional questions from the audience, and there's one related to cyber threats. So, I mean, if there's any discussions like on using Article 42.7 in a cyber type scenario, but I think we've already kind of addressed that. So I think like we could really address that question into the form of what kind of cyber scenarios do you think that the article could be most useful, for example? And then another question from the audience saying that because the EU doesn't really have military resources of its own, its member states have military resources. So for that reason, should we not completely kind of abandon the idea of using Article 42.7 as a mutual defense clause, basically? And I'll start this time with Dr. Wieslander.
Yes. Well, On cyber threats, I think, as you said, I could imagine if you have a massive blow and you realize that it's not only us, it's perhaps a few countries around the Baltics. For Sweden, it would make sense to see what kind of other assets could we get. There are cyber teams, there are, information sharing data, information intelligence, and these kind of things that could be useful in such a situation. Cyber soldiers, strengthening our systems, things like that, having teams ready. I think that's something that I could foresee, and of course that would have. For most others, then also, if you're a NATO state member, it would have a natural connection there as well. But it depends in NATO also what you evoke. If it's an Article 4, if you want to consult, or if you want Article 5, which is more punchy, of course, in such a situation. And I think this is a bit how it might work out. I think Elena, you mentioned that, and that's what would be the sequence of how to activate these articles. I think that's also very interesting to look into at various exercises and explore a bit more in these cases where it does make sense. And I think that should perhaps be main tracks of how to explore 42.7 and not so much, I would say, for the collective defense kind of risking signals of competing with NATO. I see that there are many other areas where we would need to look into this more than in such a situation. Of course, you could do that as well and see how they interact, for instance, in a Baltic Sea situation, and explore it. And the other question, what was that? Sorry.
The other question was about the EU's kind of lack of own military resources, and for that reason, should we not kind of give up on the idea of using it in a kind of collective type situation, basically, a conventional attack situation?
Well, I mean, I think we really need to be realistic here. And what would that be? It's hard to see a situation which would start where we would not activate either allies would activate NATO if it comes to that. And I mean, what would it be where we would just use the EU? I don't really see it.
I'll go next to Dr. Lazaru on this.
Yes, thank you, Nicholas. First, I want to say I think Anna's point on the sequencing was, I agree completely. She started with my point but developed it, and I really think that for the exercises, this would be something extremely interesting to see in a simulation of a real life scenario. What do allies or member states offer and contribute when you activate one article? What do they when you activate the other one? What is the difference? What's the added value? I think these are all things and practices that the exercises could bring up. On the cyber question, a situation that could be envisioned is a major cyber attack that, for example, causes for be it civilian or defense air infrastructure to collapse, be it flight control of either both military and civilian, and that would be, I think, a situation that would qualify perhaps as armed aggression. As I said, I invoked as well this what I believe is the legal council legal interpretation. And in this situation, of course, depending on the capacities of the state to deal with it, I think it would be anything could be envisioned as aid and assistance for provision of support to deal with it, provision of alternative ways of managing it, provision of infrastructure, personnel, equipment. It's very broad. And as I said, this article leaves a lot to the imagination and to interpretation, but it's definitely there. But we should also remember that cyber is also an area which is increasingly developing competence and capacities on the EU level and on the EU-NATO level. So we have a number of EU level and EU-NATO level sort of mechanisms that could also be invoked. On the military question, I think, again, on a situation of traditional armed attack, of course, a NATO ally would invoke Article 5 first. Obviously, there is a situation of the non-NATO EU countries, which perhaps would not have that option. So they may invoke 42.7. But the way the article itself is phrased, I don't see it being an issue, the fact that the EU itself doesn't have military capabilities, because the article makes it very clear that it's not about EU-level capabilities. It's really about member states assisting each other with their own defense capabilities. So I don't see it as a problem that militaries belong to member states. So I would I would say that I don't see this as a particular issue, that the EU doesn't have an army for this particular article, because that's how I understood this question.
Thank you. Ms. Virkkunen.
Yes, thank you, Niklas. Now, as we know, Article 42.7 says that if a member state is the victim of armed aggression on its territory, but I think that we should have a wider perspective for that, and like it was heard already, and we know that many member states, they have been already asking that we could use this article on hybrid threats and in cybersecurity. And I think also when we speak about European Union's defense, European Union as a defense union, I think it's a little bit misleading also, because I think defense and security union would be a better word for that, because we know that anyway, NATO is the foundation for really the collective defense for most of the member states. And I think European Union's role is a little bit wider when we think about security. Today it's very much about the external borders, it's about terrorism, peacekeeping outside of the European Union, cybersecurity. So I think it's much wider, not just defense. It's a much wider thinking about security, and it's really complementary to NATO, because we know that NATO is operating very much in this core military field, and European Union is having much more tools to do operations in larger security sectors than NATO is doing. But I think now the first thing we should do with this article and with this mutual defense clause is really that we should clarify what does it mean for the member states, and we should also decide about the decision process and about the role of the institutions. It's for sure that the Council has to make these big political decisions, and maybe it should be based now to different scenarios, and then we could discuss a little bit more among member states that for what we need this article and how we should define it. And after that, I think the Commission and EES could have a role in implementation and coordination in different operations, and also in these exercises, what we could be running after that. But of course, all the main political decisions they have to do on the Council level. But I hope we could take steps forward and we could develop this article now, because now there's still a lot of uncertainty around it, a lot of discussion. And in the same time, when we are speaking about our defense and security policy, I think more clarification is needed on that.
Thank you very much. And we're coming to the very end of the discussion, and I think it's been an absolutely fascinating talk, which could go on and on. But I don't think there's need for me to provide concluding remarks. But instead, I would ask all of you to, in a single sentence, just say, what do you think should be the next step when it comes to Article 42.7? And I'll start again with Elena this time.
Well, I think Nicholas, that the next step is the step being taken now, hopefully end of October, beginning of November, which is really to carry out and operationalize these exercises and see what that what learnings and what practices this makes seem like most like the best practice to follow, what can be learned, what is the added value, and to bring this into the policy discussion. So I would say the next step is the step that's coming up very, very soon. And I would stop here. And on this occasion, also thank you again for this very, very interesting discussion. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Ms. Virkkunen.
Thank you, Niklas. I think this was very interesting discussion, and I think I already said many times what I'm expecting to happen next. So I'm expecting that we could have a little bit more clarity and really guidance and also definition of the different roles of the institutions, and also that what kind of assistance this means and how the process would go on if we are activating this article. And I hope that in next weeks and months we can take steps forward with this.
Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Wieslander.
Thank you so much. And I'm in agreement, I think, with my excellent panelists here. I'm very much a fan of exercises as a way to develop and draw lessons and build the next steps. So I'm happy that we are moving ahead with exercises on this matter within short. I also think it's a good idea to relate it to the strategic compass discussion and the threat assessment there and the discussion. I think it's good that it's in there. If it's in the right place or not, we'll see. But anyhow, we need to address it. And the important thing, once again, is to address it from what is the reality out there and what could we need it for in reality, and not to have wishful thinking discussions, I think. What are the threats? There are so many challenges for us. How can this article be useful in that regard? I think that's really what we have to keep in mind as we move forward.
Again, a big thank you to all of you. Thank you also to everyone who tuned in today to listen into this discussion, and to those who asked questions. Thank you so much. And I would just like to wish everybody a very pleasant week. Thank you.
Thank you.